So, as you know, at this point, my name is Summer Hanage, and I'm leading the accessibility effort for mobile here at Twitter. It's been a really exciting last year. Before I started in this role, mobile accessibility was just kind of a thing we all, everyone tried to do on the side, but nobody really focused on. And so over the last year, we've been trying to really put some effort in and focus into our mobile clients so that they are accessible to everyone. So without further ado, let's dive into the talk. So just a little bit about me, just so you know, my background is actually in iOS, and before I was at Twitter, I worked at Apple on the iOS team, and that's actually how I got into accessibility. I ended up working on accessibility with the Maps team. And so because of that, I got really excited about accessibility, so I came to Twitter and took on mobile accessibility, which of course then meant learning about Android. So I've only been doing Android for about the last maybe about a year or so. So if you see errors in my code that are Android errors, that will be why. But that whole year I've been really focusing in on accessibility, so I'm pretty excited as to kind of where I've gotten. So what are we going to be talking about today? So I'd like to start just kind of coming in from the outside. So if you haven't really talked or thought about accessibility much, what is it? What does it mean to make your app or your feature accessible? And how do you test it for it? So now maybe you already have an application. How do you actually check and see, is this accessible? How can people use this? And then I want to go into a bit of kind of philosophy about how do I approach accessibility? How do I work with design to approach it? And how do we kind of think about it as a topic here at Twitter? And then I'd like to kind of switch gears and look at accessibility from the inside. And actually, we're going to be looking at a lot of code. So we'll look at the Android APIs for accessibility, starting with the basics, the content description. This is like your number one thing right there. And then we'll be going into some of the more advanced things for if you're doing custom drawing work. How do you make that kind of thing accessible to screen readers? And finally, I'd like, hopefully if we have time, I'll get to this. I'd like to take a little look at the Twitter for Android app and just see what we've kind of done, what took it from being, virtually not accessible to actually working decently well with a screen reader. So what is accessibility? I'm assuming because most of you are here, you probably already know the answer to this question, but I always like to start with it to get us all on the same footing. Accessibility is about using technology to overcome challenges. And those challenges can be almost anything. And so most commonly we think of visual challenges because the screen reader is the most kind of famous piece of accessibility kind of technology out there. And so on Android, as most of you probably know, the screen reader is called TalkBack. And this can be used for anyone who's having visual challenges, whether it's just temporary or permanent. This will speak the screen to you. And there's also touch exploration, which was integrated with TalkBack, so that not only can you hear what's on the screen, but you can touch and explore the screen with your hand. This is very similar to the voiceover technology that Apple uses. There's also Brailleback as well on Android. So and maybe you don't want to always listen to your device. You can instead have a Braille output through a Bluetooth Braille device, and that can give you Braille feedback. There's many other forms of accessibility though. For example, let's say you're motor impaired, maybe having trouble touching the screen for some reason. You may find yourself using a switch system or a joystick, which allows you to navigate the screen with a cursor. So you can move left, right, up, down, next, previous. And you can do all of that with an interface that can be controlled with your body, even with your breath, with nods of your head, various ways to control these devices. But this is another way that accessibility comes in very handy. There's also accessibility efforts out there for people with cognitive challenges. On iOS, there's something called guided access, and that allows people to kind of hone in on one app. And so instead of a device having 20 apps and each app has all these features, a guided access allows you to kind of hone in on one app, maybe even reduce the amount of buttons, the feature set, so the user can really just focus on a simple task, on the task at hand. Things like this have been used for children with autism or various attentional challenges, learning disabilities, adults and kids as well. On Android, there isn't exactly there's nothing really built into the device that does this, but there are third parties that are doing this kind of thing. So the Android devices can also be used for these purposes. And of course, for the audio, people with any type of audio or hearing impairment, there's captioning systems, and this, again, this exists on Android, iOS, very, kind of popular across the board. So that's a little bit about kind of what accessibility is and some of the technologies that kind of currently exist on the mobile devices. So what I'd like to do first is kind of focus in. So today, most of the talk will be discussing the screen readers and dealing with the switch system. Since those are, generally when you cover your bases on those, you've done a pretty darn good job of covering your bases. And so what I'd like to do is next just show you a video of someone using a blind gentleman using an Android device. Because if you haven't seen someone do this before, it's actually quite cool. And so rather than me showing you, I'd like to have someone else show you.
Hello, this is Ramaditya, and today I would like to show you how a blind person like me, see my face and my eyes. I'm blind. My beloved tablet, the Nexus 7. Hold on, there's no button in here. So how come I can use this?
I don't know, drop it.
So
7:49 p.m.
Wow.
Ringer 70%.
it has sound, so by listening to the sound, then I am able to operate this.
Slide unlocked. Slide area. Slide area. Device unlocked. Home
See,
screen
device
free.
unlocked. So that's the way I operate it. So if I point with my finger,
Home. Recent apps. Apps. Apps.
and it's going to read it for me. So yeah, just like that. It's awesome.
All right. So he goes on for a bit and does a little more demonstration, but I think you all kind of got it. So if you haven't seen a screen reader before, now you have seen one in use. So often a question that I get when I tell people what I do is, well, that's great, but why does that matter at Twitter? And at Twitter we have a lot of core values. We have these kind of rules that we try to live by, and one of those rules we live by, one of those values, is to reach every person on the planet. And in order to do that really means everyone. So we go around and we localize our strings the best we can to get different languages, but that also means reaching different types of devices, and that also means reaching people who might not use their devices in a conventional way. And so doing accessibility is important here at Twitter for that reason. But it's also important to me personally. I think that allowing equal access to technology for everyone is really a big deal. And it's very easy to make the next cool app and say, hey, it's beautiful, it looks good, and its interactions are so smooth, and not really think about, well, what if I can't look at it? What if I can't actually touch it? Is it still a great app? And that, I think, is a really important thing to ask. It's also, Steve Jobs once said, accessibility is also a case of doing the right thing. And I think I'm guessing a lot of you probably believe that, and that's why you're here to learn about it, which is awesome, and I think that's true as well. But it's also good for you as a developer or as a company, because you broaden your user base. All of a sudden, you don't just have people using your app in a standard way. They can use your app in any way. They can use your device in any way. And that's great. You have a broader set of users you can reach. Even people, maybe even elderly people that don't necessarily have, aren't necessarily blind, aren't necessarily deaf, but maybe just have challenges in those areas, can now access your app using those services. And accessibility also tends to be a way to really engage with your users. I've found that the community that uses these tools is very vocal and very helpful, and so it can be a really cool way to reach out to users and get really great feedback, and just have a cool conversation with the people around you. And lastly, it poses some awesome engineering challenges. So we often find ourselves thinking about UI. Like, how does it look? And all of a sudden, you can think of beyond that, like, well, what if I can't see it now? Like, how do I interact with it? What does it sound like? What does it mean to navigate through a flow in an app? And all of a sudden, you have these interesting challenges of, like, how can I convey this in the same way and have a great experience? So I think that on all different fronts, whether you're the engineer or the company or the person using the technology, accessibility is a really interesting thing. So as you saw in the video, how do you turn on TalkBack? Since that's what we're going to be focusing on a lot in this talk. How do you use it? So as you can see, if you haven't done it before, you go onto your device, you head into settings, and you head up to TalkBack, and you can turn it on, and there it goes. It's talking. And then you have to figure out how to navigate. And the interesting thing is, you probably noticed in that video, the gestures are not exactly the same. You're not just tapping what you see anymore. So actually, let me quickly pause. How many of you have used an Android device with TalkBack? Okay, cool. So this is new for a lot of you, which is good. I don't want to be boring people. So for those of you that haven't, and even those of you who have, there's a whole bunch of different gestures. So Explore by Touch is a one-finger gesture. So I'm going to explore the screen with my finger, and whatever's under my finger, if it is accessible, it will speak. It will say, my device will say clock, it will say Twitter, and it'll tell me what I'm touching. To actually interact with that item, since clearly one finger tapping isn't going to do anything anymore, I now double tap, as we saw in the video. In order to scroll, I'm going to use two fingers, and I'm going to scroll with two fingers because, again, that one finger gesture is now gone. Let's say I need the long press. Well, of course, everything's a long press if I'm touching to explore, so I'm going to tap and then hold. So it's a double tap and hold, and that's going to give me that long press that I would have used just a single tap and hold. And the list goes on. There's also some custom gestures that allow you to get into context menus and to explore the app in various ways. So one thing that I really want to do is encourage everyone, after this talk, preferably not during the talk, to turn on TalkBack and to explore it and to learn about how it works and to really just close your eyes and feel around and see what's going on there. So anyway, like I said, there's lots of gestures, and I put a link here, and you'll this talk will be online, and you can actually go there and learn about them, figure out how to use them. There's some context menus that I find particularly interesting with these L-shaped gestures that I mentioned here at the bottom of the slide. And this brings you into these really interesting context menus that allow you to actually change how you're exploring the text on screen. So let's say I have a huge paragraph. I can use that context menu to explore it by sentence, or by line, or by word, or by letter. I didn't know what that word was. I want to hear it spelled for me. I can actually do that. So these screen readers are really cool, really complex. Not just reading out what's there, but really letting you break it down. So yeah, just again, encouragement to keep on exploring that. So another cool thing on Android devices is most of you probably have a touch device with just a touch screen, and that's it. But most of your devices, actually all of your devices, I'm sure, support the D-pad or support directional navigation. And so this is another great thing an important thing to test, but probably not all of us want to go out and buy directional navigation by joysticks. Probably not something we're all going to do. The great thing with this is that you can actually test your switch control via the simulator. So while TalkBack is in my opinion, best tested on device, although there are some emulators that support it, or simulators that support it, I find it's easier to test on device. The D-pad control is actually very easy to test in the sim, so this is nice. And all you do is you go into your AVD, and you set up a new device, or you take a current device you already have and modify it, and you'll see that in the hardware section up here, I have D-pad support, and I've clicked new, and I've added D-pad support to this device that I built, and there it is. And so this will then allow you to, that when the hardware comes up on the screen, you'll actually have that D-pad, and you'll be able to use it to navigate as if you were using a joystick. So that kind of concludes the what is accessibility and how do I use it portion. So hopefully now we're all kind of on the same page with our Android devices. So now I'd like to get into some of the kind of philosophy of what I think it means to make something accessible. So the thing that I emphasize a lot at Twitter is the idea of equal experiences. It's very, very easy to think about putting a label on every button and calling that accessible. It's very easy to say, oh, well, this just needs to have a label on it and everything's fine. But that doesn't necessarily create an equal experience for people. So what I mean by that is, let's take a tweet as an example. So here's a tweet. This is my friend Jordan, and he's said something up here. One nice thing about 2013 has been not having to hear pumped up kicks very often. Great tweet. I really like that one. It's obviously kind of old, but good. You can see that in a tweet, there's actually a lot of different elements, a lot of different little views in that one super view. There's his picture, there's his name, there's his username, there's the text of the tweet, there are these 3 little buttons at the bottom that allow me to interact with it. There's this timestamp up in the corner. And if I were to just slap a label onto all of those items, it would take, I think there's 8. It would take 8 little navigation steps for a user with a TalkBack on to navigate that tweet. So all of a sudden they'd either have to be swiping 8 times to move to the next item, or using the D-pad, or sliding their finger around the tweet, meticulously exploring it, trying to figure out all these different elements that make up a tweet. And that doesn't really seem like an equal experience, because when I look at a tweet, I don't sit there and try to break down where each element is and what's going on. I get a tweet. It's one experience. So instead of just slapping labels on all these things, what I recommend, or kind of hope to create instead, is a similar experience. So a tweet is a tweet, so we're going to present it as a tweet. We're going to take that information, we're going to take Jordan's name and his text and maybe his timestamp too, and we're going to actually just build one string and say, here's a tweet. It's all this information right here. And then those actions at the bottom, well, those are supposed to be quick, not slow. You shouldn't have to do tons of exploration to figure them out. So instead, one of the things we did in the iOS app, and we're working on with the Android app, is having a special gesture. Actually, we finished this with Android too, is having a special gesture that just lets you get to those actions. So instead of those actions being explored, I can just do my tap and hold. I can tap and hold, and then I'll get to my actions. And on the iOS case, what happens is you do your special gesture, you get a menu. And on the Android case, if you do the special gesture on a tweet, I think the tweet fades away and the options come up behind, and you can then select which one you want. But either way, what we're doing is we're trying to parallel the experience. We want people to be able to get to the actions quickly. We want people to be able to consume the tweet as one tweet. And so that's something that I always try to emphasize. And of course, a much easier way to do this is if you think about accessibility first. If you think about accessibility when you're designing, if you think about it when you're making your mock-ups and your wireframes, if accessibility is on your mind at that point, it's much easier to say, okay, and then this is what we want to present to the user. We want to present this as one bit of information. We want to present it this way. And if you're thinking about it ahead of time, that becomes so much easier, which is why I always really want to encourage people to bake it in. Start at the beginning. Okay, here's my feature. Here's what it'll look like. Here's what it'll sound like. Here's how we'll navigate it. All at the very, very beginning. But I do know that we live in the real world, and that's not always the case. Sometimes you already have an app, you already have a feature, and you need to actually see, okay, well now what can I do? And this is kind of unfortunately probably the more common case, but that's okay. So what do you do? What do you do when you need to go take something and check, is it accessible? This is kind of an accessibility audit, so to speak. And the way I like to encourage people to do audits is kind of the same way I like to encourage them to think from the beginning. It's not about each individual element. It's is my button accessible? It's much more about, can I actually use this feature? Can I get through it? Can I flow through it? And so the way that we try to test things is we have flows. And you identify the key flows in your feature, and then you try to go through them with the screen reader, go through them with the D-pad, and see how that process feels. So for example, let's take photo DMs. So if I have a photo DMs feature and it's my job to do the accessibility audit, well, all right, let's see. I can send a photo, so that's going to be one flow. It's going to require a whole bunch of steps. I'm going to need to find my DM button, going to need to tap it, get into a conversation, maybe start a new conversation. Maybe those are two different flows actually, and then go through the whole process. And other things too, deleting a picture. Those are all different flows I might want to go through. And the reason this is important is you can imagine that even if every single button has a label, maybe I don't have enough information to actually get through a whole task. So a great example is deleting. In order to delete, I actually need to do a tap and hold. And if everything on the screen has a label, if I don't have some kind of hint or some kind of guidance that maybe kind of gives me the idea that I might want to go towards that tap and hold, I'm probably not going to know to do it. And so by going through flows, you're often able to identify bits of context that you missed. So maybe everything is clear, but maybe you need more context. Maybe you need to provide a little hint here and there. And that can often be, it can be really helpful, and that's why I recommend, actually going through the flows. So the next thing I'd like to do is show you a couple of videos of the app that I'm going to use for kind of the coding portion of this talk. So when we're starting to look at code, you're going to see code from this app I'm about to show. So I'm going to show you the app before, and then before I added any accessibility. So this is what I got out of the box just by using standard, Android, components. And then we'll show the same app after. So let's go to that. So as you can see, I was tapping the, at first I was just tapping the the picture at the top, which is a horrible, ugly thing that I tried to make called Hello Accessibility. And it wasn't making any sound. So it was clicking, there was nothing happening there. Okay. I then went to the clear button, and you can see that actually said clear button. So, okay, well that I got free accessibility with that because it was a text button. That's great. Let's keep going. Okay. All right, so again, you can see the other two buttons, because they're image buttons, not helping me out so much. They still work, they just don't tell you what they do. You can see there I'm trying to tap the dots. Again, I'm getting no feedback. So this app, clearly it adds and removes dots from a screen, but what good is that if I can't actually explore the dots? I can't know if they're there. I can't know if they got added. I can't know if they were removed. I literally have no information besides a little bit of clicking. So really not going so well. All right, there we go. So that was the application before we did any engineering work at all. This is just what we got. So now I'm going to go to the next.
Hello, accessibility, enter image. Remove dot button. Clear button. Add dot button. Yellow dot added, 1 dot. Red dot added, 2 dots. Red dot added, 3 dots. Clear button. Remove dot button. Red dot remove, 2 dots. Red dot. Yellow dot. Clear button. Cleared all dots.
Okay. So now we have labels on our buttons, we know what they do, and when we actually interact with them, we actually hear what they did. So, add dot actually adds a dot and tells us how many dots we have on the screen. Remove dot, a similar kind of experience. The header image now tells us, hey, I'm an image. Kind of gives us a little description, hello, accessibility. So it's gotten a lot better. And so that's what we're going to kind of explore today when we look at some of the coding examples. All right, so now let's actually look into some of the code. So the very basic, kind of the most basic element of Android accessibility is content description. And raise your hand if you've seen content description. Yeah, so we've pretty much all seen content description. If you use a lint checker, you can even flag if you aren't actually putting a content description on things. So what the content description is exactly what it sounds like. It describes the content of the view to which it's attached. And as of, I believe it's API 18, but I want to double check that, the content description actually even automatically appends the type of element that it is. So a button will actually get the word button for free from the framework itself. And so you can see I can add a content description in my XML, or I can add it in code. And you can see up on the screen, you can do it either way, Android : content description, or set content description in your code. And this will allow you to set it for your element. The one thing where you don't use content description is generally the edit text. There you're going to use the hint. The hint is also the text that, of course, you see as like the little placeholder in the edit text. And this is what Android recommends doing, is just using that hint. And in fact, you'll get, if you try to use both, you'll get a little warning. So just something to be aware of. So the content description is what you're going to use to, like I said, describe everything. And the awesome part is that is so much of the accessibility work you'll need to do is just putting these content descriptions on. So that's kind of great news. It's not exactly a difficult task. There's a few other things to think about when you're just dealing with the basics. There's the concept of focus. And focus is mostly for D-pad. So if an element is focusable or not focusable when I'm moving around with that D-pad control, that's what I'm setting when I set the Android focusable or call set focusable. The other thing that you can control when you're dealing with focus is it's not just whether or not something can be focused on, but the order in which things are focused. So you can imagine if I have an app with maybe like a sidebar type of experience, and I actually want to navigate down that sidebar before I'm exploring things over to the right. Then I can actually use next focus up or down or left or right. I can use these attributes in order to change the focuses, the order of the focus as I move to next item, previous item, etc. So this can give your app a more logical flow when someone's exploring it with the D-pad, which is really nice. Another thing is labels. So sometimes we get into a place where we actually already have the content description or the information on the screen, but it's in the form of another label. So you can imagine if I have a text field and it's got a label on the screen that says name, and then the text field, and inside the text field it says something like, Johnny Appleseed, then that information's all on screen. So how do I associate that label to that text field through the audio? So you can use, for this case, you can use the label for attribute, and then your screen reader will actually interpret that and read it so that it will actually announce that this label is for this text field, or perhaps that this text field is for name. But it'll associate the two in the readout, which is really nice, because then it's not just like there's random text on the screen next to a text field. It becomes much clearer what's associated to what. And sometimes you just don't want things to be accessible. So sometimes you have an image on the screen that is purposeless. It's just there for decoration. You can't interact with it. It doesn't give you any added information, any added context. And maybe in that case, it's just not, you just don't even know what to put on it, and there's just nothing you can think of. So this can happen, and that's when you have two different ways to make things to kind of turn off accessibility. So there's important for accessibility, and this came into play API 16, and you can just set that to no. If you're supporting before API 16, you can set content description to null. And these both work. I've found a few bugs with both. They can be a little glitchy, but generally speaking, they work fine. And this will let you turn off any talkback that you don't want to hear. So as you can see, the good news is most of your accessibility work can just be done by adding attributes to your XML files. So far, everything you saw here was XML-able. You can just do it right there. Of course, if you need to dynamically change your content description or change your labels, you have the option to do it in your code, which is nice as well. But that's kind of great news that you can do your work that way. Question? So the question was, I mentioned that text fields, I recommended using a hint. But I also talked about label for and using that with a text field. So what is the best way to go here? How do we do that? Can we use both? Did I get that? Awesome. The great thing is the hint and the content description, those don't really work together on a text field. But the label for, because that's not actually applied to the text field, but applied to text that's next to the text field, it works with it. And so what I recommend is you have both. You have the hint, which is actually in the text field. That's the text you can both see and hear. That would be like Johnny Appleseed in my example. That'd be your hint. And then the label for is used for name in that case. And so name would be name, label for, text field with the hint Johnny Appleseed. So the question is, what if you don't want to have a label next to your text field? Then what? And that can be a sticky situation. I've had to deal with that myself as well. So one thing I have actually done is, and this is like a little bit of a sticky solution, is I'll actually detect if TalkBack is running, and I'll modify the hint on the text field to make more sense if I know that TalkBack is running. And so if TalkBack's not running, the hint is whatever the designers want in there. If TalkBack is running, it says something that really makes sense if I need to hear it and I can't see it. So that's one solution I've employed. There are some other things you can do, but yeah, that's one way to go. Good question, really good. And now we're going to move to some code. So you just saw an app, you saw it being inaccessible, and then you saw it being accessible. So I'm going to actually show you now the code that I added to the application to take it from point A to point B. And you'll see that most of the accessibility that got added to that app that I just showed you is done in this first section. So before I get into the part of the talk where we talk about custom drawings and fancy stuff, a lot of the work you'll see is already taken care of just with these basic principles. So let's go explore that code together. There's really only a little bit of code here. It's a tiny app. So we have a main activity. We have a custom dot view that does the drawing of those dots. So that's all done with custom drawing. And over here is the XML file that supports my layout for pretty much everything you saw. So those are really everything. And then of course strings file, things like that. So now what we're going to do is we're going to see how we added those labels to the buttons and to the header image. So you can see that in the XML right here, there's no header image. Oh, let me go back to presentation mode. All right, so in the XML, we have the image view. Here it is. And in the image view, we needed to add a content description. So all we did is we added it right here. Simple as that. Similarly, we had these buttons. I made two different types of buttons just so you can see it works with either one. So I had the minus button, which is a standard button, and I used the minus text. And the screen reader actually didn't read the minus text. It just didn't say anything for that. And so I again added a content description, one line. Our clear button, we already got that. We got the content description for free because it actually had a text attribute. So that just came along when we had that text attribute. And then we have an image button, and that's how we did our ad. And again, nothing more than a content description. So really, that was pretty much all of our accessibility right there. Add dot, remove dot, clear, and finally the content description on the header image. So that's the really cool thing, is that it's just as simple as adding those few lines of code, and I already got a lot more. You could also argue that maybe that header image, maybe that actually didn't need to be accessible. Some people might argue that, and that's fine too. And so you can see right here, I commented this out, but all I would have had to have done is add important for accessibility equals no to my image view, and that would have completely turned off the screen reader for that image. So that would have been another option if we thought that image really didn't matter for us. So that's that. So we saw some of that code. So that was like painfully simple code, not challenging, which is exciting. So now let's get to the kind of the more nitty-gritty part. So we saw turning accessibility off and on. We saw adding the content description. We talked about labels for text fields, which this app didn't have any text fields, but you can imagine it would be the exact same process. So now let's get into some of the custom stuff. So before I just dive into the code and show you how the custom view happened, let's do a little bit of history. So the accessibility frameworks on Android didn't come about all at the same time. And that's why if you have gone digging through them, which I imagine some of you have, you find that they are not particularly simple. They can be accessibility event, accessibility node info, accessibility delegate. There's all these things, and if you look at the APIs, they're huge. And so kind of why is this? So way back, accessibility was primarily event-driven on Android. So an event came in. There was no Explore by Touch. That didn't exist. You couldn't do the touching your screen and exploring. So events just came in. It was a tap. Wherever the cursor was, that's what got tapped. And that event was then processed, and you heard something from the screen reader. And then Explore by Touch came to exist, and there needed to be a better way of mapping the actual kind of on-screen hierarchy. So that's when you got these accessibility node info. This is essentially a node can be a one-to-one mapping, but isn't necessarily, of your view hierarchy to these accessibility nodes that provide the extra info. What type of element is this? What's the content description? Where should the rect go on the screen? Kind of what's the frame? And so all that info is then encapsulated into the accessibility node info. And that was great. That seemed a lot clearer once this Explore by Touch came into play. But then we had events and node infos, and somehow had to deal with all of this when trying to make anything remotely custom accessible. And it got really stressful. It would actually take, I don't remember, it was like hundreds and hundreds of lines of code to make something like this little app accessible as far as the dots were concerned. I mean, it was silly. I tried. And luckily, API 16 rolled around, and we got Explore by Touch helper. And this is like the most joyful thing that ever happened, in my opinion. It was very great. It simplifies dealing with these events and dealing with this accessibility node info, and basically gives you about 5 methods that you need to override. and then you provide all the information you need. And so it wraps all that. It's backwards compatible down to API 4. And so now if you need to do anything custom, you pretty much can just deal with Explore by Touch Helper and call it good. There are some rare occasions where you actually may need to go and do some custom accessibility overrides in a view you've built, but those are going to be the slim circumstances. This will actually be like the 99 out of 100 for you. And so it's really cool. So we're going to explore that Explore by Touch Helper now and see how easy it is to use and to work with. Explore by Touch Helper, here we go. So the first thing is before you can use it, you do need support libraries. So this has bit many a folk, is that you need to make sure that you add that. So if you're using Gradle, for example, I just use Gradle because that's what we use, you need to add the compilation of the support library into your Gradle file. So just something to be aware of, because a lot of people will go to type in Explore by Touch Helper and, oh, it's not there, where do I get it? That's where. So what Explore by Touch Helper is doing in more the abstract sense is it's providing virtual views for each item in your view. So in my case, I had dot view. Dot view is filled with items when dots are populating it. And those are going to be virtual views. Since those are all drawn, they're not actual views, they're going to be virtual views. And so that's what these nodes are. These are going to be my virtual views. And these virtual views are just managed by IDs. These IDs are going to be local to my containing view. And so these IDs can be as simple as, an array from 0 to n, where n is the number of dots I have on the screen. So I don't have to hash anything. I don't have to make any complex IDs. These IDs are just my local ID system that I've decided to use. So in order to use Explore by Touch Helper, it's the easiest way is just subclass it within the container view class. And then you're going to set the delegate, the accessibility delegate of your container view to be your subclass, an instance of your Explore by Touch Helper subclass. And so you'll use the view compat class, which is, again, backwards compatible all the way back to 4 to do that. So you can see up here on the screen, we've got, I have a private class, .touch helper, and that's just extending the Explore by Touch. And then I've got that, just initialized down here. And so you can see in the initialization, I save my view, and that's about it. And I didn't include the code where I set the delegate, but I will show you that in a second. So after I set my delegate and I create my little subclass, in that subclass, I just need to do 5 overrides. And those are going to be how I provide the information back to the view so it knows how to handle the accessibility. So these are the 5, and we're going to go through each one by one, so don't worry about writing them down or anything. But this is them just directly off of Android's documentation. So the first one, get virtual view at. So you are going to get an X and Y in your host's coordinate system, and it's your job to say which virtual view that is. So in the case of my dot view, I'm going to get an X and Y that's hopefully somewhere in my dot view, and I just have to figure out which dot that is. If I have more than one dot in a given space, maybe I want to pick the top one. And then that's it. I'm going to return the locally decided upon ID back, and that's it. If for some reason I get a point that is not a dot, I'll return an invalid ID, which is already defined for me, and that's all I have to do. So you can imagine if I'm keeping an array of these dots, which I am already, because that's how I'm managing them, it'll be very simple for me to just map this X and Y to a dot, return its index, and be done. Get visible virtual views. So this is when the system is asking what virtual views are currently visible on the screen. So rather than giving me a point that someone probably touched, it's just asking me what's there. And what's going to happen is you're going to be given a virtual view IDs list that's going to be passed in, and you're just going to add integer objects to it that are the integers of the indexes that you are passing back. So in my case, because I'm probably just storing all my dots in an array, I'll just go through that array and return an integer for 0 through n, where n is my number of dots. If I have something a little more complex, let's say my dots can go in and out of visibility, kind of arbitrarily, I may need some more complex logic to actually determine what I'm putting into this list that I'm giving back. But luckily for me, we don't need that. So you may have more logic here than what I'm going to have, but it's still pretty simple. Next is onPerform action for virtual view. So in this case, you're going to get a virtual view ID and an action, and possibly some arguments. And this is how you handle any actions. So long press comes in, what do I do? And that's where you're going to handle it. I have found this method, just a fair warning, to be a bit buggy. It's not always called when I expect it to be, so I'm still trying to figure that out. I talked to some of the Android folks and they said, yeah, it's kind of buggy. So that's okay, it's not just me. And if it's not just you, if you hit that too. But generally, this is what it does. If you choose to handle the action, you're going to send back true, otherwise false. And like I said, this can be click, long press, hover, those kind of things. So that's perform action for virtual view. On populate event for virtual view. So this is, this is the tricky one. Not because what you have to do is tricky, because it's just hard to explain. So this is essentially legacy support. So when I talk to the Android guys and I'm like, why do I have to deal with events? And they're like, well, because you have to. It was pretty much their answer. I was like, okay. And so what's going to happen here is you're going to get a virtual view ID. You're going to get an event this time. And you're going to populate that event. So the one thing is that you have to set a content description on that event. You absolutely have to. Your app will crash if you don't. So you get a view ID. In my case, it's an ID for a dot. And I figure out what color that dot is, let's say, and I attach red dot to that event. I say set content description, and I send it, and it goes back. And the interesting thing is I have set, pretty much any word on these events, and it is rare that is ever used, ever. So this one's a little funny because it's pretty much just legacy support, and there's only a few cases where the information you provide to this event is going to actually be read out. Nonetheless, you still need to support it. So just something to be aware of. If you're trying to set a lot of custom things here, this isn't really the place to do it. You want to generally handle your actions in the actions and handle the virtual view info in the next method, which will be my node method. But just FYI on this one. And you'll notice you don't have to set a frame or any type of bounds on this. And that's because this is old event support. So back in the days of events, there was no incoming information about the touch besides that it happened. So we didn't need to worry about that. So then we get to the big guy on populate node for virtual view. And this is the one where you're going to do all your actual custom work. So my node is my virtual view as far as I'm concerned. I'm going to be supplied with an accessibility node info compat, backwards compatible again. And I'm going to absolutely have to set a content description, and this is the one that you will hear read out to you, the red dot, the yellow dot, the blue dot. And I have to supply bounds. That bounds determines where that little rectangle is drawn around my dot. If I supply bounds that are empty, if I do not supply a content description, I crash. So always supply these things. And note that your bounds must be relative to the host view, to the parent view, so to my dot view in my case. If you are an iOS developer and you're used to doing accessibility over there, you'll know that bounds for your custom views are set in screen coordinates. So this is an important thing to know if you're working on both platforms, is that for Android, you're setting in the host coordinate system and they take care of any weird conversions for you. And those are your 5 overrides. But wait, there is one more. So those are the 5 overrides you're going to do in your Explore by Touch helper subclass. However, you also, if you want to support that Explore by Touch, that ability to hover over elements on the screen, you need to also override dispatch hover event, because that's going to be the call that's made when you're hovering. And so you need to basically say, ask accessibility to ask your accessibility delegate to deal with that for you. So this you can pretty much copy and paste it. It almost always looks exactly the same. You just say, if I've got it, if my helper responds to this, then return that. Otherwise, I'll deal with it myself. And so this is what's going to give you that extra support for Explore by Touch. Whereas if I didn't have this, I would have to use swipe navigation in order to get to my dots. So that's just that little last thing. And that's going to be overridden in your parent view, in the view that's housing the dots, rather than in the Explore by Touch helper. So a few other things that you can do. And you'll notice in the app, when I added a dot, I got an announcement. So I wasn't touching anything at the time. I'd already touched something. The dot was added, and I got this announcement that said, red dot added. So how does that work? So you can also call this really handy method announce for accessibility, and that literally will just speak whatever you need it to. So if if I'm waiting for something to happen, I'm waiting on the network, and something goes through, a tweet goes through, I can speak about that. So this is the method that gives you the power to actually say something out of the blue, to say something that's happened. I've noticed that it doesn't seem to be based on any type of queuing system, so it is possible if you make too many announcements too close together, they will kind of just clobber each other and you only get one of them. So something to watch out for. Don't rely on that too much. Another thing you can do is you can move TalkBack focus. So maybe I added a dot and now I want to actually send that cursor directly there. Maybe I want the user to get there right away. So if I need to move TalkBack focus, I have a thing called Accessibility Manager, and one of the things it can do is send accessibility events. So in this case, I would send an event of type view focused to my view that I want to focus on, and I would get to do that. And so this is again, you don't want to do this too much. It can sound like really fun. Okay, I can move focus wherever I want, but you want to keep the experience relatively predictable, so you don't want to be shoving focus everywhere all over the place. But there are places where this does make sense to do, so you may want to do that. Okay. Oh, question. Yes. So there is a the question was, she's looking at some code, and there was an English string in announce for accessibility, and she was wondering if it makes sense to actually put that in strings.xml. And the answer is yes, of course. So with some of my demo code, I didn't get around to throwing all the strings in the strings file, and sorry about that. But you always want to do that, of course. Any strings you're using for accessibility should be in your strings file, and if you're supporting other languages, you want to support them for your accessibility strings too. So that's always true. Always do that. Bad example. So let's go look at the code and actually see a real live Explore by Touch helper and see actually how simple it is, which is really the best part. Okay, here it is. So this is the dot view. This is the one that's doing all the magic with the dot drawing. It's not particularly exciting. You can see I have a method add random dot. It's going to calculate a random center point for me, and then it's going to add a dot. Right, here's the accessibility portion. So I go and in my dots array, I can get the paint index, and I actually have a static name array of strings. And so once I know which paint I'm using, I can just ask which color is that in string form. I can get that information. And then I'm actually going to, in my add random dot, I'm going to announce for accessibility. So I use that information and I make that announcement. So here we go. And you can see that I should be using a plurals file, but again, rushed code demo. We can see that I'm announcing for accessibility. I have a format that I created. You can take a quick look at it. There it is. You can see I have formats for dots being added, singular and plural, dots being removed, singular and plural. I even have if you try to remove a dot and there aren't any dots, we get an announcement for that as well. So you can see that's how that works. So if we go back, there we go. So there's my announcement for adding. For clear dots, you can see I do another announcement right here. And let's see, remove dot, somewhere in there. Remove dot, yeah, so add and remove, Remove dot, again, more announcements. So all those announcements were created, just one line of code each, pretty simple, having some format strings and populating them. Now let's get to the fun stuff. Let's get to that Explore by Touch helper. So first, we are going to view compact. There it is. All right, so can I get click out of that? All right, so here we have the mview dots helper. I create an instance, and I set the accessibility delegate to the helper. That's it. So that's how I link up the two. And this is really funny because this is like the one line that I find when I'm teaching this in class format, most people forget, is they'll get the whole delegate written and it'll be beautiful and they'll be like, why isn't this working? And it's this one little line that's so easy to forget because everything compiles just fine, everything runs just fine, you just forgot to set the delegate. So don't forget to set the delegate is the moral of the story. And then let's actually go look at this little helper. Okay, here we have. we have my dot view touch helper, and it really is going to do exactly what you expect. As you saw, my dots are just kept in an array called the member dots array. So we'll start with the first method. We'll just kind of walk through them quickly and make sure they all make sense. So here we go. We get an X and a Y, and I ask my view, which dot is under that. I have a little helper that's going to find that for me. And you can see I'm just looking through my array. I'm going through backwards so that I'm sure to get the dot that's on top. Because since I'm adding them in order, going backwards makes sense in this case. And returning nothing if I don't get a dot. All right, so that's okay. There, we're back. And so you can see that if I don't find a dot, I return invalid ID. If I do, I just return the index of that dot. So no special computation for my ID. I just give them the index because those are unique in my worldview as far as my little view is concerned. Visible virtual views, very simple again. I just go through my dots array. I add the index of every dot to the list. That's it. Nothing more than that. Populate event. Again, very, very simple. We get our dot for the virtual view, which is nothing more than looking at my dots array and getting the dot at the given index. All right. And then if for some reason the dot is null, I throw an exception because that should never, ever, ever happen. And otherwise, I'm setting the content description. Remember, even though I'm probably never going to use this, and I could probably put any word here, you do want to set an accurate one. And in more complex handling, you can actually check this event. So for example, if I do want some kind of custom behavior to happen when a hover happens, you can actually check what this event is and see what's going on. But for the most part, most things can be handled in your actions. So that's all I need to do there to make sure this method is not going to crash me. Populate node is, again, this is the one that you really care about. This is where you actually want to make any, if you want to set these dots as clickable. If these dots were actually checkboxes and I wanted to set them to have a checkable property so that TalkBack speaks checked, not checked. If I wanted any of that kind of behavior, all that's going to go into my onPopulate node method. That's where that all goes. So here we have it again. I'm just looking up my dot. And I can show you guys actually what a dot drawing is in just a second. I realized I didn't cover that. If my dot is null, again, should never ever happen. There we go. Otherwise, we are setting the content description. Again, we're looking at that name of the color. We're setting the bounds in parent. Set bounds in parent is the thing that you have to call in order to set the bounds and make sure your rect is not 0. And I'm adding an action. I actually didn't use this in the demo again, but if I wanted to click the dot, this is where I would add that action. So you can see I can add an action. I could also say node set checkable. I could set checked. All kinds of different little things I can do here to just give the screen reader, give the switch system, whatever I'm using, more information. On perform activity, on perform action. So I'm not actually doing any actions on the dot. So you can see. Let's see, what am I doing here? Nothing, absolutely, oh yeah, there it is, return false, nothing, I'm doing nothing here because I didn't have any actions on these dots. And that's most common case. And lastly, this is just my little helper that you saw earlier, and that's just how I find out which dot I'm over. So that's not an override, just a helper method. So you can see I had my 5 overrides. And a lot of you question I often get is, well, what is a dot drawing? And that's just nothing more than a little tiny representation of my virtual view. So it just tells me where the center is, what the radius is, and what the paint index is, really. That's all it is. So it just puts all that information that allows me to draw that dot, gets it readily available for A, the drawing, and B, for accessibility. That's all that is. The last thing is that hover. So what about the hover? There it is. Can I go back to the action click?
Yeah, down there. Do you actually need that at the bottom?
This?
Yeah.
No. That text is really only there to show you that that's where that text goes if I were to have a click. Yeah. Because sometimes people will try to put this stuff in the event, and it's just important to remember it goes with the node. But yes, you're right. I actually don't need that for the demo you saw. Yep, going back to my hover, just so everyone can, hover. There it is. It looks exactly like the slide. Dispatch hover event. Nothing exciting there. That's how I get my hover. All right, So that's kind of the staring at the code portion. So if you have code questions, this is a really great time for them. Is there anything organizationally that would go into an activity? So generally with this level of customization, this is really view-based. So I have not yet seen at Twitter or in my own code a case where an Explore by Touch helper, that kind of thing, would go into an activity. Occasionally, I'll set content descriptions in activities. I've set label for a few times, just because I might have references to the views and it can be easier to set them there. But I find this true in iOS as well, that really the custom work should be kept to the view, because it really is it's part of the view. It's part of the view providing information about itself. So either kept to the view or maybe in even a separate class and then just referenced by the view. So that tends to be how I do it. But again, I'm not an Android expert, so someone who's more Android-y may know more. Any more code questions? So let's see if I understood the question. Would I recommend doing like a dispatch hover event override on something that's already a button or a text field? Those already have like natural accessibility, but there certainly may be cases where you actually need to change that behavior. Those might be a little more far-flung. But if, for example, you actually did want to maybe customize what happens when you hover on a button, this could be a place to do it. It's not to say that it's a bad thing, but it's probably not a common thing you'll do. Usually this is done with something that's subclassed off of view to customize it.
Yeah. Do it off the action bar as well?
Action bar. Oof, I don't know. I haven't had that come up. So I haven't had, the question was, would you do these overrides on an action bar? And my answer is I honestly don't know. I haven't had that come up for me, but it is an interesting question. Okay, so we've had a lot of fun with a demo app, and it's great. We added dots, but maybe that's actually not how it works in the wild, and I just led you all astray, and it was terrible. But luckily, that's not the case. At Twitter, this is everything I've shown you is how we've done accessibility and how we've taken the app from, quite frankly, not working with a screen reader, not really working with anything, to working decently well. It's not perfect. We have a ways to go, but we're certainly on a great track. So this is all the same stuff we've been doing. People have often commented on how Android isn't really caught up to iOS, and that's true both in our Twitter client and in the real world. The APIs themselves really haven't quite caught up yet. For example, iOS, rather than just having one label for an element on screen, you can have a label, a value, a hint. These are all separate things you can attach to one thing that's accessible. So I can have something that, also traits, I can have all these different traits. So there's a lot of information that kind of finer grained tuning you can do in iOS that just simply isn't available on Android. And that's just something that I know that the team over at Google is working on, and we're working with, and something that we're all learning. So just to kind of show you that this is actually how we do it at Twitter. We have image buttons, and here you can see we add content descriptions to them. Photo, camera. These are our photo and camera buttons straight out of the app. Nothing fancy. And we have them. We use a lint checker. So if someone tries to add a new button and they don't add these little strings, they're going to get flagged, and they're not going to be able to submit. So that's good. They can put null. So if they're feeling crotchety, they are certainly, they can put null, and that does count. So we'd have to try to keep tabs on that. But yeah, this is what we do. We have custom elements too. So something that does happen in a bigger app is that we actually build things that are completely custom. Our own little widgets, all kinds of things. So sometimes we have to, those things obviously don't come with content description just built in, so we have to add it. So you can see here with our toolbar, we have a overflow button that we've custom built. And so I have a toolbar overflow content description that I've added to the attributes, and that then allows me to set the content description. So you then can see in the code that I just pull that string and I can apply it to the toolbar. So it's nice because even if something doesn't have it built in, by adding the attribute to the attributes file, you can still get that accessibility with only a couple lines of code. Again, it's really simple. And we have Explore by Touch helpers. We have, I'm not sure how many now in the app, a few for custom work we've done. And for example, our home view. So our home view, it was all kind of custom rendered, and we wanted to allow users to tap back or to tap on the actual name for the view that they were currently in, because that was all just one big thing and they couldn't differentiate between going back or just finding out what view they were in. And so we just created this little Explore by Touch helper that it didn't even need the array. We didn't even need that. We had two indices, 0 and 1, 2 virtual views, and we did our overrides, and that's it. We like broke down that little home view, and now it's usable. And so again, we're using this exact same stuff, nothing too fancy, right in the wild. So another thing that we use accessibility for both on iOS and on Android is automation. So the automation frameworks are built on top of these bits of information we can add to our views. It makes sense, right? Automation wants to talk to views. We want views to talk, so it all makes sense. And so the content descriptions are not just important for what the screen reader reads or what your Braille back gives you in Braille. It's also important for your automation if you have UI automation. And so it's a great way also to encourage developers to add content descriptions, because you say, hey, like you add a label to your button, you can automate tests and you can be sure your feature isn't broken. So it's another kind of great integration. But there can be issues, because on iOS, we hit this little roadblock where we realized that sometimes automation and user-facing accessibility want different things. So I, writing code for user-facing accessibility, want a tweet to read out the tweet. That's what I want. But my friend Jordan wants to automate it. So he wants it to say something like tweet cell ID blah, blah, blah. And that's not really going to help anyone with a voiceover or TalkBack. So what we did on iOS, and a solution that we're working on Android, is actually having different builds. And so we have a little build flag, and we can basically change out which label we're providing depending on if we're building for automation or if we're building to ship. And normally, obviously, you don't want to do that. Normally, it's not a good practice to not test what you ship. So you want to be very careful with that approach, and do make sure you're still, make sure those are the only things you're swapping out. You're swapping a string for a string, never a null for a string, never anything like that. A string for a string, and that's kind of the agreement we came to that let us keep it relatively safe, so that we can have our automation and our accessibility, and everyone's pretty happy about it. And so the last thing that we kind of try to do at Twitter is just keep the conversation alive, and that's one of the biggest things. Is it's really easy to get excited about this and write the code, but accessibility, it's like localization, it's like all these other things where you can't just do it once. You got to keep it alive. You have to keep talking about it. Bring in design every time as features evolve. Really try to bring people together, keep this conversation going. If you're part of a bigger company that actually has a design team, designers often help us with copy. So if you need to make sure strings are good, make sense, that kind of thing, design is often really good with helping out with that. So that's a great interaction to have as well. It's just like talking about the strings. What strings make sense? How do we do this? And as was brought up earlier in the talk, localizing. Another thing that we always make sure to do here, and that I think is really important, is that accessibility should work in every language that you support. All of them. Try to localize. So those are kind of the final reminders, and that's about it. So thank you all for coming.